We're starting on Daf Mem Aleph, 4 lines from the top. Omar Rav Chiste. So the Gemara here sort of starts a new inyan. It was discussing regarding the Sa'ir and the two Se'irim on Yom Kippur. How do you designate them? The maskan of the Gemara was, according to Rabbi Yanai's opinion, there's only one way. You must use the Geirel. Can't just designate it by calling it, by saying it. So now the question is, when it comes to other karbanis, how do you designate any carbon to be a carbon? So the Gemara brought before, it's by just naming it that way, by saying it. So the Gemara is going to say exactly when that has to be done. So when you have kinin, so again, kinin are birds that are brought for, let's say, a zav or a yeldis, that have to bring 2 birds. One is going to be a oila and one is going to be a chatas. So you can't, to be mefarish them, in other words, to designate them specifically, whether it's going to be a chatas or a oila. When is that done? You have 2 times it could be done. Ela oibel kichas bailin. Either the owner does that when he buys them. At the time that he's buying it, he says, this I'm buying for an oila and this I'm buying for a chatas. Oy basiyas kayim. And if it wasn't done then, the other time it could be done is by the kayim. When he actually shechts them, when he makes them as a carbon, so then he designates them and says, this is for a chatas and this is for an oila. But any other time in between, you cannot designate it for an oila and a chatas. Meaning if the owner, while he bought them, forgot to designate them what they are for, so then it can't be designated afterwards. You have to wait until the kayin is going to actually do it and bring the carbon, and then he designates it. So the Gemara is going to ask a few questions on this chiddush. So first he brings the source from the psukim, where he sees this. My time Rav Chiste, what's the source of Rav Chiste? The chsev, in one pasuk it says, and this is a pasuk, it says by the zav, or by the yeldis actually, v'lakcha. So the full pasuk over there that it says is v'lakcha shtei teirim, v'lakcha shtei teirim mishnei b'nei yayna. Then it says echad la'oila echad lachatas. So that's what it says by the yeldis, that when she takes it, when she buys it, then you designate a oila and a chatas. And then there's another pasuk which says by the zav v'asa. Over there it also says v'asa kayin. It's echad oila v'echad chatas. So what do I learn from this? You designate it to be a oila or a chatas either when you buy it, or when the kayin makes it for a carbon, but no other time in between. Now, Meisvei, the question on this is, and this is a brayse that was quoted before, va'asahu chatas. So the brayse says regarding the karbanis on Yom Kippur, so you have to designate it. You designate that sa'ir that's going to be la'Hashem. You designate it for a chatas. How? Ha-gairel lois a chatas. Only the gairel designates it for a chatas. Ve'ein Hashem lois a chatas. You just calling it as a name to be a chatas will not designate it as a chatas. And the Bryce explains what the chiddush here is. Sheyachal, I would think, v'alei dinu, it's a kal v'chaymer. Uma b'makom shalei kiddush ha-gairel. In a place where the gairel is ineffective. It is not sanctified to be a chatas. Kiddush Hashem, but calling it by mouth, saying that it should be a chatas, does work. So makim shekiddush ha-gairel, in a place where the gairel is effective, ein adin sheyikadosh Hashem. Don't you think that calling it by name to be a chatas should be effective as well? Therefore, Talmud Loima, the pasuk there specifically says, "V'aso chatas," that only the gairel makes it a chatas. Ha-gairel lois a chatas, ve'en Hashem lois a chatas, and the gairel will not designate it as a chatas. Ve'ein Hashem lois a chatas, that is, and the Shem, calling it by name to be a chatas, will not make it a chatas. So now, what was this brayse suggesting? This brayse was suggesting that instead of the gairel making it a chatas, the Kohen Gadol, just by naming it to be a chatas, that should work. Now, when would the Kohen Gadol be doing this? Doesn't it seem we're talking about instead of the gairel, he should call it as a chatas in that time of the gairel. Instead of doing the gairel, then he should call it as a chatas. But if so, the question is, vahahacha. But over here, if we're talking about at the time of the gairel, the lav shas lekiche, that's not the time when you're buying this animal, and also the lav shas asiyihi, and it's also not yet the time when you're making it as a carbon. The katani, the kava, and the brayse was suggesting that if the kain would call it as a chatas, it would become a chatas. The only reason it doesn't work is because the pasuk clearly says vasahu chatas through the gairel, but otherwise it would work. So this is a question of chiste. I see that you could designate it as a chatas, not at the time when you're buying it, and not at the time when you're doing the carbon. Amar Rave, so Rave responds, no, that's not the pshat in the brayse. Hachikama, this is what the brayse meant to say. If in a place where the gairel is not effective at all, even if you'll use a geidel at the time when you're buying the animal. Or va'afilu b'shas asiyah, you're using a geidel to designate it for its carbon, even at the time when you're making the carbon already. So it does not work. Kiddush Hashem, but nevertheless, calling it by name works. B'shas lekiche, or b'shas asiyah, when you buy it, or when you make it as a carbon. So if so, mokim shekiddush hageidel, shaloi b'shas lekiche v'shaloi b'shas asiyah, if we see that the geidel works on Yom Kippur, even when it's not when you're buying it, and not when you're making it as a carbon. So ein edin sheyikadosh Hashem b'shas lekiche u b'shas asiyah. So definitely, shouldn't it help to designate it as a chatos when you're buying it or when you're making it as a carbon? And Hamul Daima, and that the Brisa says, we learn out, so chatos, that a geidel is a chatos, ven Hashem is a chatos. That only the geidel designates it for a chatos, and not calling it by name. So the Brisa only meant, like Rav Chisda said, at the time of when you're buying it or when you're making it as a carbon, not any other time. Another question on Rav Chisda, Toshema, it says in the Brisa, metame mikdash, a person that was tamei and came into the Beis HaMikdash. So he has to bring a carbon, but there's a unique kind of carbon which is called a carbon oil v'yored. Oil v'yored means it goes up and down. What means the up and down? That there are different categories of karbanis. If you're rich, you bring one carbon chatos. If you're poor, you bring two birds, one for a chatos and one for an oila. And if you're very poor, so then you actually bring a carbon mincha, which is just from flour, right? So over here, what happened? We're talking about a person that became tamei the Beis HaMikdash, and he's ani, he's poor. And he designated money for the birds that he has to bring, one a chatos and one an oila. And then v'hesher, then he became rich. Now if he's rich, he's not bringing the birds anymore. Now he just has to bring one behemoth. When you're rich, you bring a behemoth, only one, a chatos, that's it. And then, after he became rich, he says, this money I designated should be for the chatos, and this money that I designated should be for the yaila. But now he doesn't have to use them anymore. So what does he do? How does he sort of exchange that money to be used instead only for one chatos of an animal? So Maisif umevi chayvasai midmei chatasai. What he does is, so he has to add money to the money that he had designated for the bird to be brought as a chatas in order to be able to buy with that money what he's going to need for one animal as a chatas. But ve'ein maisuf umevi chayvasai midmei lasai. He can't add any money to the oila that he has to use the money of the oila for the chatas, because you can't exchange. You can't use the money of the oila for the chatas. So that money is going to have to be used for a donation to bring a carbon to Beis HaMikdash as an oila, but it can't be used for the chatas. That's what happens if the person was poor and then he became rich. That's the braisa.
What happened if you had the birds already and then
Oh, that's a different story. The Gemara is soon going to discuss that. We'll see. So the Gemara says, V'hahacha. Now, if you look at the simple pshat of what this braisa says, so what are we talking about over here? The lav shas lekiche, v'lav shas asiyah. We're talking about a person over here that designated his money to be for a chatos or to be for an oila. When did he designate his money? Not at the time when he was buying anything, and not at the time when he's making a carbon. The katani, the kava. And it says in the braisa that he was poor, then he became rich, and he had that money that he separated to be used for the oila and the chatos while he was poor. Then he became rich, and then it said in the Braisa, after he became rich, then he said, Eilu lechatasei ve'eilu lo'ilasei. And what did it say? That it takes effect when he designated it. He designated that money, this should be for the oila, this should be for the chatas. It establishes it. Even though it's not at the time when he's buying anything, it's not at the time when he's making the carbon. So we see that the designation works in between as well. Amar Rav Sheishes, so Rav Sheishes responds and says, V'tizbere, is this a good braisa that could be accepted as it's written? That's how Rashi teaches v'tizbera. Is this braisa a mitaretz that Rashi says? Is it acceptable the way the braisa is written? There has to be something that is a mistake here. We have to read the braisa differently. And he brings because V'amar Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Rabbi Ishia about a similar kind of a story. Metame mikdash asher. How about a person that when he became tamei, so the opposite, he was rich, and he should bring just a behemoth, one behemoth as a chatos. And instead, vehevi carbon ani. He brought a carbon as an ani, as a poor person, which brings only two birds, one for an oila, one for a chatos. So he says, lo yotza. He's not going to be yotza because he's supposed to bring one behemoth as a chatos. Now the question is, v'kivin de lo yotza, if he's rich, and he's supposed to bring a behemoth, And you're saying that he designated now the carbon when he was rich, the birds like for a poor person. So he's not Yaitse B'chlal. That's not a carbon that's intended for him at all. Heichi Kova. How does it get established B'chlal to be a carbon? If a person designates a carbon for something that he can't bring, that he's not supposed to bring at all, how does it get designated as a carbon at all? So what is it saying over here? That he brought the carbon of an ani, he's not Yaitse. There's no carbon B'chlal. There's nothing done here. Elamai is loch lemeimar. So what are you going to answer? How do you read the pshat of what Rav Oishia just said? The case is as follows. Shekvar Omar Mani Yusay. What happened was, this person became Tomei in the Beis HaMikdash, and then he was poor. When he was poor, he designated the carbon, and then when he designated the money for the carbon, when he was poor, he designated it for an oil and a chatas. Then he became rich, and he went and used what he already designated before when he was poor as an oil and a chatas, and he's saying that it doesn't work, because now you're rich, you can't use what you designated before when you were poor. So that's the pshat in what Rav Oishia was saying. So the Gemara says the same pshat has to be applied to the Braisa. Hachanami, the way to read the Braisa before is Shekvar Omar Mishas Hafroshe. What happened was, this person was poor, and then when he was poor and he designated the money, then when he designated the money, he said, I'm designating this money for a chatos and this money for an oila. When you look before in the Braisa, that's not what it said. Before in the Braisa it said he put aside money, but he didn't designate it yet. He became rich. After he became rich, then he designated this should be for an oil and this should be for a chatos. That's why the Gemara asked the question. That's too late. You can't designate it at that point. So now what the Gemara is saying is, no, the way to read the Braisa is, by the time of the Hafrasha, when he was poor, then is when he designated it to be an oila and a chatos. So Rashi explains that this fits with what Rav Chisda said. Rav Chisda said that you could designate something for a carbon or for what it's intended to be, b'shas lekiche, when you buy it. So says Rashi, it's the same thing when you designate, when you're mafrish, that is. When you separate the money, it's similar to when you're buying a carbon. Then you could designate it to be for an oila and a chatos, and that's what the Braisa before was talking about. And our proof is from the way Rav Oishia said this as well. But the Gemara asks on this, so you have a raya from what Rav Oishia said, but not everybody agrees to that. Ula Rav Chage om Rav Yoshia. Rav Chage said in the name of Rav Yoshia, or some say it was Rav Chage that said in the name of Rav Hoshia as well, the Omar that says, Yotza, that a poor person that became rich, and then he brings the carbon, when he's rich, he brings the carbon of a poor person, he's going to be Yaitze. He will be Yaitze. Right? Even a Usher that brought the carbon of an ani, you're not supposed to, he's supposed to bring the carbon of a behem of a rich person, but if he brought the carbon of an ani, he is Yaitze. What are we going to say? Because according to him, you don't have your raya that you said before. According to him, we go back to the Braisa, the way it says before, that he was poor and he designated the money, but he did not designate it for the oila and the chatos, and he only designated the money later. Our question was, how could he designate it later? It's not a carbon that he's supposed to bring b'chlal, so the designation later doesn't work. The answer is, according to Rab Chage, even if you designate it later, after you're rich, it does work. Because b'di yeved, a rich man that brings the carbon of an ani, you could designate it later for being a oila or a chatos. So if so, we see over here again the point that we said before, that later, after he was mafresh the mois, much later, he goes and says, this should be an oila and this should be a chatos, and it takes effect. So that's not like Rav Chisda said, that it could only be done either at the beginning, at the time when you're buying the carbon, or designating, or separating the money, or later when you're making the carbon. So the Gemara gives a different answer. Elo Amos, so rather you have to say the pshat and the braisa before differently. V'achakach lokach v'omar. And then he went and bought the birds, and then he said, this should be an oila, this should be for a chatos. So until now we were learning pshat and the braisa that we're dealing only with money. He separates money, he designates the money, but now the Gemara says, no, what it means is, not that he just had money. When he went to buy the actual birds, then he came and said, this bird should be for an oila and this should be for a chatas. And that's exactly what Rav Chisda said. Then the person can designate what's the oila and what's the chatas when he's buying it. So the Gemara asks on this, so Maisif umevi chayvasai. It's said in the Braisa, the halacha here, that now, because he's rich, so what does he do? He uses the money of the chatos, or actually now we're saying he already has a bird. So he has to take that bird and he has to add to it in order to be able to bring an animal for his chayva, because now he's rich and he has to bring a behemoth. My new, what does this mean? He already bought the bird. So once he bought the bird, what does it mean that he's adding to it to bring a chatas, which is a behemoth? So what are you going to say? The pshat is the podikle. So now he has to take this bird, redeem it, and now take the money and buy a behemoth, carbon chatas. But you can't do that. For the rule is ein paidin la'oif. You're not allowed to redeem once an oif is designated and bought to be a carbon. It can't be redeemed. Rashi brings in the Gemara Menachos that there are three things that can't be redeemed: the birds, the levaina that's used by the lechem aponim, and klishadas. Once you designate klishadas to be klishadas in the Beis Hamikdash, it can't be redeemed. So how could this person redeem this bird to be used now for carbon chatas? So the Gemara explains, no, the pshat, the way you're supposed to read the braisa here is as follows. Amar Rav Papa says, Kagoin shalakach preda achas. What happened is, this person was poor, and he had the money that was designated for the poor carbon, which is one for oila, one for chatas, and he bought one bird. He didn't buy both yet, he only bought one. And now, what the braisa is saying is as follows. If you bought a carbon oila for your bird, but the chatas money, you did not spend yet, you did not buy the bird yet, so then it's very easy. So then you still have the money for the chatas, and that could still be used and add money to it for your carbon chatas, a behemoth. That bird that was already bought for an oila, you can't use it anymore, you don't need it, you're a ashir. That's going to go as a donation to be brought as an oila. If the reverse happened though, if you already bought your bird as a chatos, so that now ein meisuf mevi chavasai, you can't add and bring midmei oilasai from the oila, from the money of the oila, you can't add to that to bring for it a chatos, and also from the chatos you won't be able to use it either. And v'hai chatos ozlo lemisa, and this chatos, once you bought already the bird, it can't be redeemed and it can't be brought as a chatos either. So this chatos is going to have to be left to die. This is a halacha l'moshe misinai. Once you have a chatos that's possible, it's not brought as a donation. By an oila, the halacha is if it can't be brought, it's brought as an adava. But by a chatos, if it can't be brought, it has to be left to die. That's what the braisa was saying over here. Now the Gemara is going to very shortly over here discuss this machlokes itself that it brought before regarding a person that is rich and he brought a carbon of a person that brings when he's poor. Is that acceptable or that? So Gufa, let's look at that halacha itself. So we had the machlokes. He became tummy, went into the Beis Hamikdash, and he's rich. Vehevi carbon ani, and he brought the carbon of a poor person. Lo yotza. He's not yotza. But Rav Chaga says the name of Rav Oishia. No yotza. But the Yevet, he is yotza. That's the halacha by a person that's tummy. So the Gemara asks from a similar halacha regarding a mitzayra. Meisvei, we learned in the Braisa, Mitzayra ani. A Mitzayra also has a similar halacha. If he's poor, he brings birds. If he's rich, he brings an animal. So a Mitzayra that's poor, Shehevi carbon asher, and he brings the carbon of a rich person, Yatza, is Yaitza. He even brings better than he should have, so he's Yaitza. Asher, Shehevi carbon ani. An asher that brings the carbon of a poor person, Lo Yatza. He's not Yaitza. So we have a clear Braisa that even b'di Yeved, you can't bring the carbon of a poor person by a Mitzayra. So why should the person that's Tameh, that has a similar kind of halacha, be any different? So the Gemara answers, no, Shani, Hasam, there it's different. The Chsev, because the Pasuk says, Zeis. The Pasuk says, this is what should be brought, so it's saying that we're very particular. A poor person should bring what he has to bring, and a rich person what he has to bring. So the Gemara asks, if so, if you're very particular, because it says Zeis, if so, the first half of the Braisa as well, a poor person that brings the carbon of a rich person, it should also not be acceptable, because it says Zeis, you have to bring exactly what your status is. So the Gemara says, no, but Harabi Rahman, on the other hand, there's a word in the Pasuk there that comes to include and says, Tairas, which means the Taira of all the Mitzayras are the same. So it's coming to say that they could all bring the same. So therefore we say that the rich person cannot bring the poor person's carbon, but the poor person is allowed to bring the rich person's carbon. And the Gemara brings a proof for this in another Braisa. Ve'hatanya, we learned this way in a Braisa as well. Tairas l'rabis mitzayras ani shehevi carbon asher. The word tairas is coming to add and say a poor person that brought the carbon of a rich person is yaitze. Yachal afila asher shehevi carbon ani. I would think the reverse is true as well. A rich person that brings the carbon of a poor person should be yaitze. Tamad laima zais. There the Torah is saying no, that zais, the rich person has to bring the carbon of the rich person. So now why would we not learn out from a mitzayre regarding a person that's tamei that has to bring a carbon to apply the same halacha? V'neilaf mina. Let's learn from the mitzayre to a metame mikdash. Miyat Rachmana, no, the Torah is memayit and excludes and says, Ve'im dal hu, if he is poor. So it's referring to a dal hu, that only over here regarding the carbon of a mitzayda, we say that the poor person brings the carbon of a rich person is yaitse, the rich person that brings the carbon of the poor person is not yaitse. But not b'nigeya tu metamim mikdash. It's only hu by the mitzayda. Zakta Mishnah, we go back now to the halachas of Yom Kippur. So where were we holding? The Mishnah continues, B'nigeya to the Sa'ir HaMishtalech LaAzazel. That Sa'ir that's sent off to the Azazel. We're done with the Geidel, and we know one goes to the Azazel, one goes to the Karban Chatas. Now we have to separate them. So what we do is, Kashar, Loshen Shal Zahiris, you tie a woolen red thread, B'roish Sa'ir HaMishtalech, on the head and the horns of the Sa'ir that's sent away to the Azazel. And you position him over there by the door where he's going to be sent out, by the Shar Nikner going out in the Azara to go to be sent away. And then to the other Sa'ir that's going to be shechted as a carbon, by the place of his shchita. So the Gemara will explain exactly what that means. What we separate them from each other. And now, Baloi Eitzel Paroi, the Kayin, before he actually shechts the carbon of the Sahir, so he goes back to the par. There was the par of the bull of the Kayin that he had before that was between the Ulam and the Mizbeach, that he leaned his hand on it and he was already confessing on it. He comes back and confesses a second time. So Baloi Eitzel Paroi Shniya comes there a second time. The same Yadav, and again he leans his hands on it, Mizvada, and he's going to confess again. And now he is going to confess for himself and for all the Kainim. And this is what he said. Anna Hashem, the right girsa, the right order in the Mishnah here is Anna Hashem avisi pashati chatasi. We already learned about this before. Avisi is when a person does an aveda willingly. Pashati is when he does it as a rebellion, and chatasi is when it's done b'shoigig, by mistake. And here he adds also, the second time he adds, Ubeisi, Ubnei Aaron, people in my house, and all the Bnei Aaron, the Kainim, Am Kadeshecha, On Hashem, Kaperna, Lavenis, Lapsham, Lachataim, Shavisiv, Shepeshativ, Shechatas, Lefanecha, Ni, Ubneisi, Bnei Aaron, Am Kadeshecha, Kakasa, says Moshe Avdecha, as it says in the Torah, Ki Yoma, on this day, Yechaper Alechem, L'tayir Eschem, Mikol Chatisechem, Lefnei Hashem, Tetaru, and the Hain, and all the people standing there that hear the Kain saying, the Eibish's name, Einen Achrav Baruch Shem Kaved Malchusay Li'olam V'ad. Okay, so the Gemara will explain now, what does it mean when it says in the Mishnah that the Nishchat, the carbon that's going to be shechted, so Keneged Beis Shchitase. What do those words mean? Ibaya Lahu, does this mean Vila Nishchat Akshire Koi? Does this mean that just like regarding the carbon that you send off to Azazel, you're tying a thread and you're tying it on its horns? So over here as well, when it says that the nishchat keneged beis shchitasai, what this means is that you have to tie a thread in the place of the shchita, tie a thread around its neck to indicate the fact that this behemoth is going to be shechted. Is that what the Mishnah meant to say? Or maybe the pshat is different. A hamadakoi. It doesn't mean that you tie any thread. It's just referring to where you position it. Just like the Mishnah said regarding the sari going to the azazel, that you position it by the door going out. So this carbon, you position it facing the other direction, going inwards over there where it's going to be shechted. Tashema, the Gemara brings a raya, the Tani Rav Yosef, because Rav Yosef said, Kashar loshen shel zahiris b'roish sar le'mishtaleach. You tie the red thread on the head of the sar that's going out to the azazel. Ve'amidoi keneged beis shiluchai, and you put it over there facing in that direction. And then v'la nishchat, the one that's shechted, you tie, or what do you do with the nishchat? Keneged beis shchitasai, by the place of the shchite. But here he says, what's the purpose? Shelo yisarev zeh b'zeh. You don't want these two goats to get confused with one another. But also, this goat now that's going to be shechted, you don't want it to get mixed with any other animals that might be there in the Azara. So now how are we going to be sure that this goat is not going to get mixed at all? So the Gemara says, if you're going to say that when it says that la nishchat keneged beis shchitas, it means that this animal, you tie a red thread around its neck, so then shapir. So then we can understand it's not going to get mixed with the other goat that has a red thread tied around its head, and it's also not going to get mixed with any other animals because it has a red thread tied around its neck. But if you're going to say that all you do is you position it in that place where it's going to be shechted, but you don't put any red thread around its neck, it's not going to get mixed with the other goat that has a red thread on its horns, on its head, the high kotterbe, the high loy kotterbe, because the one going to the azazel has a red thread on it, and this one does not have a red thread. But it could get mixed with other animals that are there. If it has no red thread around its neck, why shouldn't it get mixed with anything else? So this shows you, this teaches you akshire koi. And when it said in the Mishnah, kenegad beis shchitasa, it means you have to tie a red thread around its neck. Shema mina, this is a raya that's what's done. Rav Yitzchak said, so we're talking here about this red thread that's tied on the horn of the soira mishtaleach. There's a red thread that's used in other places as well. By the para duma, there's a thread as well. Shtei l'shainis shamaiti. I heard the halacha about two of these threads, of these red threads. Achas shel para. One red thread that has to be used by the para duma. It's burnt in the fire of the ashes of the para duma. V'achas shel soira mishtaleach. Another red thread is used to put on the horns of the soira mishtaleach. So what I heard was, achas tzricha shir, one of them has a certain measurement of an amount, how much it has to be, and v'achas ein tzricha shir, and another one does not have any shir. V'lo yadaina, and I don't know, hai minaya. I'm not sure which one's which one needs a shir and which one does not. Amar Rav Yosef, so Rav Yosef says, nechsi anan, let's see. When it comes to the soir that's sent out to the azazel, the boy chaluka, you have to actually split it. What's done is, half of it is placed on the horn, and another half of it is placed on the rock, on the top of the mountain there, before they send it down, the mountain of the azazel, or down this cliff. So boy shear, so because you're splitting it, so it has to have enough to be able to cut it into two. V'shal para, but what do you do with the red thread by the para duma? It's thrown into the fire. So it doesn't need any shear. The loy boy chaluki, you don't have to split it. So therefore loy boy shear. So therefore it could be even the smallest amount. Rami Bacham asks on this, the para nami, but even the red thread used by the para dume, it should also need a shear. Why? Boy kaivid, because it has to have a certain weight. Why does it have to have a weight? So Rashi says, when you throw it into the fire, what happens if you're going to throw this tiny little red thread to the fire? By the time it gets to the tip of the fire, it's going to immediately be burnt up. It's never going to go into the fire. And the pasuk says you have to throw the red thread. Rashi brings the pasuk here, al toich sreifas apara. Got to go inside the fire. So it has to have a certain weight to land inside the fire. So therefore it should have to have a shear because of the weight it needs. So Rava responds to this question, Koivit tanoihi. This requirement that it needs weight to land into the fire, that's a machlokes tanoim. As the Gemara is soon going to explain the source of this machlokes tanoim. But now the Gemara first asks, Udepara loy boy chaluka. This red thread used for the para duma, does it not have to be divided like by the soira mishtaleach? So Abaye asks on this. There's a lashon that the Mishnah says in Masechta Para. What do you do with this red thread? Keir chan b'shiyarei lashon. There's the eitz eres, there's the cedar wood, and there's the azov. So you tie them together. What do you tie it together with? With the leftovers of a red thread. So the lashon of the Mishnah there is shiyarei lashon. Shiyarei lashon means leftovers. Leftovers means that you cut it, that there was a bigger part and you have to cut it and then there's leftovers. So it sounds like it also has to be split and cut. So the Gemara says, no, that's not the pshat in that Mishnah. Eime biznav lashon. It doesn't mean with the leftovers, but what it means is with this nav lashon, which means that you have to comb it. They combed it, and then what happens when you comb it is, it's like a tail that at the ends of a tail, it becomes like a split. Sort of, the threads get split open. So that's what happens over here as well, that you comb it and it comes out and it gets sort of split open. That's why it's called shiyarei lashon. But it doesn't have to be cut at all. Now here the Gemara is going to bring the source of what we said before, that according to Rava, there's a machlokes regarding this red thread that you throw into the fire by the para duma. Does it have to land inside the fire or not? So you have the eitz eres, there's the wood that's used, and there's the shnit telas, and this red thread, shekol tosan shalheves, that the fire immediately burnt it, the flame immediately burnt it, and it never landed inside the fire properly. Ksheira. That's okay, it's going to be kosher. So the Gemara asks that the question is, it says in another brayse, nis hav. If it immediately got singed in the fire, before it landed in the fire. Nishava v'loshen, the red thread immediately got singed. So then it's not good. Maybe loshen acha, you have to bring another red thread and throw it inside the fire. It should land inside the fire. Or mekadesh, and you have to be mekadesh it and throw it inside the fire. So we see over here, samachleikis, it seems. Does it have to land inside the fire or not? So the Gemara gives two answers. One answer, the Gemara says it's not a machlekes. Amar Abaya loy kashi. This is not a question. Kan b'koilachas. One kind of fire is as a huge flame that's going up very high. Koilachas means like stalks of wheat that grow up very high. So you have a fire that goes up very high in the air. So if you have a flame of fire that goes very high up in the air, and the moment you throw the thread, it immediately catches it on fire and it burns it right there, that's not going to be good. It never went into the fire. Then you have a fire that's laying down low, and you threw it into the fire. Could be it did burn it immediately before it landed, but it sort of goes inside the fire because it's a lower fire. That's the difference between these two statements here. Rava says it's a machlokes. Kavit tanoihi. This whole issue of whether the red thread has to land inside the fire or not, it's a machlokes tanoihi. The Tanya, because we learned in Abraisa, lama kairchan. Why is it that what did they do with the red thread? They tied the wood and the grass, the ezav, they tied it with the red thread. Why did they tie it? The reason is because you want it all to be united as one. The purpose is the Torah wants it to be together as one. That's the reason. Divrei Rebbe. That's Rebbe's opinion. Rab Shimon says that's not the point. The reason is the reason is because if you're just going to throw the red thread into the fire, it's never going to land into the fire. It's going to get singed by the fire before it lands. So you tie it together with the wood in order for it to be heavy and it should land inside the fire. So right there I see it, it's a machlokes whether it has to land inside the fire. The Gemara now concludes and says that really, we're talking about the red thread that's used by the para aduma, and we had the red thread that's used by the sa'ir that's going off to the azazel, but really there's a third scenario. I heard that there's three different red threads. Achas shal para, one is by the para aduma, v'achas shal sa'ir ha-mishtaleach, the other one is by the sa'ir going to the azazel, v'achas shal mitzayre. By the carbon of a mitzayre, there's also a red thread that's used. And I heard that achas mishkal asara zuz, one has to be the weight of 10 zuz, v'achas mishkal shnei slime, and one has the weight of 2 slime, v'achas mishkal shekel, and another one is a weight of only 1 shekel. And ve'enli lefarish, and I don't know the weight of which one is which. So Kiyasa Ravin, when Ravin came, Pirsha Mishmei the Rabbi Yonasan. So he said in the name of Rabbi Yonasan as follows: Shal para, the one of the para aduma mishkal asara zuz. That actually has to be the heaviest. As Rashi says, going back to what we said before, because it has to be heavy enough to land inside the fire. V'shal sa'ira mishtaleach, the one that's being sent off to the azazel. So that's mishkal shnei slime. It has to be the weight of 2 slime. It has to be enough material there to split it, to put half on the head and half on the rack. V'shal mitzayra, the one that's used for the mitzayra, has to be the least. Mishkal shekel. That has to be just the weight of a shekel. That's the least weight. Let's, if we could just finish this Indian over here. So the Gemara says, Omer Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Yechanan said regarding this, Pligi ba Rab Shimon ben Chalafta v'Rabbanan. That really this is a machlokes of Rab Shimon ben Chalafta and the Rabbanan. B'para, regarding the para aduma. Chadamar, one says mishkal asara, that the red thread used by the para aduma has to be the heaviest, 10 shkalim. The chadamar mishkal shekel. No, it's the lightest. And not in between light, it has to be only a shekel. The simanach, just as a simon for this machlokes, that they're arguing in minakotza lakotza, whether it has to be the heaviest or the lightest, echad amarbe ve'echad amamet. One says the most, 10 shekel, and one says the least, just 1 shekel. So they're arguing about the para aduma. That's Rabbi Yechanan's version. Amal Rabbi Yirmiyah medifta leRavina, so Rabbi Yirmiyah medifta said to Ravina about this machlokes, loy bepara pligi. Rab Shimon ben Chalafta and Rabbanan, they were not arguing about the weight of this thread regarding the para aduma. They were actually arguing about the sar sent away to the azazel. And Vahu Yoma, it was on that day when this argument was had in the Bismedrish, Noch Nafshe de Ravye Bar Kisi. There was a Chacham by the name of Ravye Bar Kisi that passed away. Va'anchu basimana, and they said a simon about the fact that he passed away then when they had the discussion about the soira mishtaleach, Ravye Bar Kisi mechaper, that him passing away will atone for Averis, kisoira mishtaleach, like the soira that's sent away to the Azazel that also atones for the Averis. So that was their simon, that the discussion was not about the para aduma, but the discussion was about the Soira Mishtaleach.